Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, March 7th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. This week, Michael Bueckert from Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East sits down with Libby Davies. The two discuss how CJPME hopes to make solidarity with Palestine an election issue this year, as well as how Bueckert's own education and activism led him to his current position as acting president of the organization. Dr. Michael Bueckert has a PhD in psychology with a specialization in political economy from Carleton University. He has written for publications including Africa is a Country, Jacobin and Briarpatch. He is also the co-editor of Advocating for Palestine in Canada. He joined CJPME as vice president in June 2020 and became interim president in January 2025. Here are Michael Bueckert and Libby Davies in conversation. Take a listen.
Michael, I'm delighted to speak with you today about your new role as acting president at Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, or also known as CJPME. And for listeners familiar with the organization, you'll be aware that Tom Woodley, the founder of the organization in 2004, made a personal decision to leave his position as president at the beginning of this year. As a volunteer board member at CJPME, I know his groundbreaking work and dedication to the organization's mission is greatly appreciated. So, Michael, you have taken on a new role leading the organization as acting president since January. How is that going, especially given the ongoing crisis and genocide in Gaza?
Thanks, Libby. Really great to be here. It's a challenge, I think, for an organization that's moving on from, the founder of the organization that has been with it so many years. I think that's going to be a challenge for any organization like ours. And to do it in these circumstances where we're facing some of, the greatest threats facing Palestinians in a long time, it's daunting, but we have a really great, dedicated team who are really, really committed to making as much of an impact as we can to try to change public opinion on Palestine, to try to push our politicians to take stronger stances in support of international law. And so we're doing a lot of things in spite of the transition and hoping that we're making as much of a difference as we can.
Well, I think CJPME is a very well-known organization across the country. It is a national voice for those Canadians who have been interested in peace and justice in the Middle East, and particularly for supporting Palestine and Palestinians. You've been at CJPME for a few years, but I'm sure you must have your own ideas about the future direction and work on CJPME. So maybe you could just speak a little bit about that. How do you think, are things going to change at all? How do you see that happening? What kind of future direction do you foresee for the organization?
Sure. Well, what's interesting about CJPME is that even though we've been around for 2 decades, it's really only in the last few years that we've grown to an organization that has more than a few or a handful of employees. We now have a team of about 10. And we've really expanded our operations under Tom's leadership. We created the Media Accountability Project. So we have a team that's working on monitoring the media coverage on Israel and Palestine, and responding and engaging with journalists and getting corrections and combating media bias. And then we've also expanded our parliamentary work. We have a full-time person on Parliament Hill who is engaging with politicians in a more regular way than we ever could before. And there are just so many ways that we have expanded as an institution to cover these areas in a more, things that we've always done, but now can dedicate full-time people towards. And I think in the short term, it really is about expanding and strengthening these parts of our work so that we can become an institution that has a regular presence, that has a meaningful voice and impact, that people listen to, that we can exercise power with decision makers. And so I think for the short term, we're going to be focused on making sure that we can do this as effectively as possible and expanding that work, as well as looking to the various elections that are happening this year and seeing if we can intervene in a way so that Palestine is part of the national conversation.
Yeah, I know that CJPME is very active in social media. You mentioned the Media Accountability Project. And I mean, it's really been a terrific initiative in terms of analyzing and monitoring the media and calling them to task. And you've had when they've incorrectly reported or been prejudicial in their reporting. And you've called many organizations, media organizations, including the CBC, for sure the National Post, but also others. So I think that's been a very successful initiative. And am I correct that you also have members of CJPME who also sort of help with that in terms of following up with letters to the editor and things like that? Is that part of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, with most of our projects, we really do try to prioritize getting people involved. Like, how do we not just work on these issues as a small group based in Montreal, and but how do we make sure that we can empower people to get involved themselves, give them the resources? So we do have a team that is, working on this full time, but we also have what we call media responders. So anyone can sign up to be a media responder, and occasionally we'll send out alerts for a particularly bad article, maybe an article that expresses a lot of anti-Palestinian racism, or where there's a significant error where they refuse to say the West Bank is occupied, something along those lines. And then we'll have an alert so that people can write in, and together we can make quite a big impact this way, and have gotten quite a few changes since we've been active. We also have, for really dedicated volunteers, people who can be more involved on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, this is something that, of course, for many years, people have been writing letters to politicians. There's always been bad media coverage, but there's never been a systemic, sort of regularized way that we can be at this every single day and provide, put real weight behind these actions. And so I think with the media team, we've really been able to do that, and I'm excited to see, uh, where this goes. And part of the reason that this needs to exist is because there's so many on the other side, supporters of Israel, who are doing this and have been doing this for many years. Have been, every time if there's someone who's Palestinian who's interviewed, or a journalist accurately expresses sympathy for the human suffering in Gaza, there'll be, that there'll be organizations writing in to try to have that undone. And so there needs to be a counter pressure. There needs to be people writing in saying, we actually like this coverage, and when they fall short, that journalists are going to be held accountable as well.
Michael, I know you worked very closely with Tom, the previous and founding president, in your previous role as vice president of CJPME. And in fact, you yourself have a long record of involvement in human rights for Palestinians and a free Palestine. So it would actually be great to learn a little bit more from you about who you are, Michael, and what brings you to this work.
Yeah, it's sort of a long story, and I won't go into all of it. But I think, part of my interest in social justice comes from my background in the Mennonite tradition, which has a strong history of pacifism and support for human rights. But my real interest in Israel and Palestine came from actually when I was visiting apartheid South Africa, well, post-apartheid South Africa in 2006, about 10 years, 12 years after apartheid ended, learning about the experience of racial discrimination, learning about the comparisons to Canada's own history of colonialism. And shortly thereafter, Jimmy Carter issued his book, Peace Not Apartheid, which really helped to mainstream the comparison of the treatment of Palestinians to the experience of Black South Africans. Palestinians and scholars have been making that comparison for many decades prior to that. And since then, we've come a long way with groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, definitively making the case for why Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid. But at the time, it wasn't very mainstream. He did a lot of work in sort of showing the similarities. And that, as someone who just had just visited South Africa, I was very much interested in learning about that. But especially at the same time, Canada was showing unconditional support for Israel. So, learning that Israel was committing these atrocities similar to what I had learned about in South Africa, finding that, my own government was actively complicit and supportive of these same atrocities somewhere else in the world, I think was uh, really provocative to me and really engendered in me a sense of injustice that I sort of took with me. And since then, I had been involved with various activism on campus. And, the time I started getting involved, this was the rise of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement and Israeli Apartheid Week, and new and creative ways that people were finding to get involved and to challenge their institutions over their complicity in human rights abuses. And then finally, during my PhD, I was studying the history of the anti-apartheid movement in Canada, and I kept coming across these very eerie similarities where I was reading about how defenders of South Africa, as they were trying to push back against the boycott movement, they made all of these arguments about why you shouldn't do that. And it just struck me as so identical to what I was hearing from supporters of Israel when they tried to defend that country against the BDS movement, talking about how the country is being singled out for criticism and held to double standards. And, if you listen to the demands of these boycotters, the country faces an existential threat, whether that's from communism or terrorism. So it just struck me that the debates over Israel today, there's a sense that it's unique. There's something unique about it. It's often cast as this is anti-Semitic if you even try to criticize Israel or if you want to boycott Israel. But at the same time, these debates over boycotts were identical. There was nothing new. And in fact, there are many actors back during the apartheid days against South Africa who also try to shut down boycotts, try to shut down activism. So my research eventually evolved into a comparative work looking at these different movements, how these apartheid lobbies formed and how they tried to push back against boycotts. So I spent a lot of time on that, and then eventually, once I finished my PhD, I came to Montreal, joined CJPME, and sort of put into practice some of the academic work that I had been doing. So yeah, I've been sort of thinking about this for a while, and about how we can sort of bring the lessons from previous movements against apartheid into the present and make sure that we can replicate. Because if you remember the history of South Africa, the civil society did eventually put enough pressure on the Canadian government to impose sanctions on South Africa, and that is largely credited with bringing an end to discrimination and the birth of democracy in South Africa. I think a similar pattern is happening in Canada, but there's a lot of work. There's a lot of work to do.
Let's move a little bit now to just sharing your thoughts about the situation in Gaza now. Certainly, over the last year and 4 months, we've seen significant changes in terms of the public response. And I think there are many organizations, Palestinian organizations, allied organizations, certainly Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, who have helped galvanize and facilitate a sharpening debate and idea about what is taking place. The situation now, of course, we have a ceasefire, it's fragile. Tell us what Canadians can do to demand that the Canadian government take a stronger position, because as CJPME has documented so very well, it's been very up and down at the UN and sometimes good and sometimes horrible. But what can we do to support a stronger position in Palestine in terms of statehood and of course, the massive issue of reconstruction, if it's, of course, now already threatened by what the president of the US is dreaming about?
Yeah, it's a big question. And I think now that Parliament isn't in session at the moment, and there are these various, the Liberals are having an election for leader, and the federal election is looming probably, if not within weeks and within months, it makes it a little bit harder to sort of to push for policy change, although those elections themselves will provide opportunities for approaching and engaging with candidates and getting them to take stronger positions and seeing who will actually pledge to support actual policies, to address this situation. I think, but and we can talk more about sort of how we're going to engage in the election coming up, but I do think that right now there is such a need for maximum pressure to show that Canadians care about this, because there is a risk that with the ceasefire currently that people are going to stop paying attention. But the risks of violence and dispossession have not gone away. Since we started the ceasefire, Israel has killed over 100 people in Gaza since then. Netanyahu clearly wants to sabotage the agreement before it reaches a conclusion so that they can go back into Gaza and to reoccupy. Well, they still occupy, but directly put boots on the ground again. And Donald Trump, his remarks about Gaza have really emboldened the most genocidal aspects of the Israeli government. He came out saying that his plan now is for the US to take over Gaza and to permanently expel the Palestinian population. And, maybe sometimes we don't always take Trump seriously, but the Israeli government does, and Netanyahu and all the opposition leaders have welcomed Trump's comments and have started to sort of put some of the wheels in motion, tasking the Israeli military to develop plans for how they're going to help facilitate people out of Gaza. And his other Israeli ministers are more openly talking about all Gazans out of Gaza. So we are sort of in this moment where the threat of looming ethnic cleansing at a mass scale is on the table and being spoken about in public. And at the same time, the West Bank, more than 40,000 people are displaced because Israel has stepped up its attacks on refugee camps. This is really a very serious, grave moment, and the Canadian government has been almost entirely silent. I think they put out one of the weakest statements I've ever seen on an issue, and it's possibly because they don't want to offend Trump, because with this looming trade war, there's a very real possibility that Canada will just acquiesce to these changes, to these threats, so that they don't upset Trump more than he already is. But that's just such a cowardly approach, and it really threatens to make us much more deeply complicit in atrocities than we already are. So in this moment, we really do need to be putting as much pressure on our leaders as possible to make sure that Canada isn't silent or even complicit in these unfolding atrocities. We need to be doing something, and of course, recognizing Palestinian statehood is one of the things we're calling for, but also we need to be pushing back and combating some of the real violations on self-determination that Israel is committing. So we need accountability more than anything. We need there to be accountability for genocide. We need an arms embargo that is complete without any loopholes. We need sanctions on Israeli leaders who are committing and threatening to commit genocide. And we need Canada to commit to really enforcing the ICC arrest warrants against Israeli leaders like Netanyahu. So there are these concrete policy tools that should be the simplest steps for Canada to take, that Canada would and has taken immediately in cases like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but refuses to touch in this critical moment. So that's a long answer to your question. But yeah, I think there's lots that we can do, but there's more importantly, there's a huge need for us to become involved more than ever, despite the ceasefire at the moment.
Absolutely. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME, has always had a critically important voice nationally. And I think many Canadians rely on the organization for its excellent analysis and research provided by CJPME. You mentioned the federal election. Just briefly, what plans do you have for what we think is going to be an upcoming federal election?
Well, we've always engaged in the election because we think it's really important to make sure that Palestine remains part of the conversation. Of course, it's very few people vote based on foreign policy, and Palestine is only one of many issues that people care about, but is a very relevant and important policy issue that leaders need to be responsible for. It shouldn't be pushed to the sidelines despite all of the economic challenges and threats from the US. It needs to be part of the conversation. And, following over 15 months of genocide, politicians need to be held accountable for what they did during that time. What did they do as these horrific abuses were happening? Did they continue to support the Israeli government during this time? Did they support efforts like the call for an arms embargo? What did they do? I think we need to hold up their record and look at that in comparison to what they're promising today, and really hold them to account for what they've actually done. So we always release an assessment guide that looks at the record of the political parties, and we will be doing that. But we're also looking into other ways that we can amplify this message and break through into the national conversation more than we have before. And I can't say too much about that now, but we are trying to think in this historic moment. Here's an opportunity to hold our our prospective leaders accountable and set the terms, I think, for what action the next parliament takes, whoever leads it. So stay tuned for that. But it's very important that we don't give our leaders a pass for inaction on human rights and genocide.
Absolutely. And as you say, foreign policy in a federal election isn't exactly considered to be a vote determining issue. But given what's happened over the last 14 months, and the breadth of concern and activism by Canadians in holding the government to account around the genocide in Palestine and its ongoing positions. Maybe, I mean, I'm an optimist. Maybe this will become part of how people decide to vote in an election. So I think the work that you do on the federal election and providing that information analysis will be very, very important. So that's really great you're doing it. Well, Michael, it's time to wrap up our conversation. And I just do want to say that it's been a pleasure to talk with you today. You do have a big job ahead of you. I know you have a good team of people with you. And you have support across the country from a very strong base. So I want to wish you all the best, and thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks, Libby. Really appreciate it.
That was Libby Davies and Michael Bueckert in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Libby and Michael. To learn more about the work Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East does, please visit cjpme.org. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. Here to bring us up to date is Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. This week, Rabble's Jack Layton Journalism for Change fellow Eleanor Wand shared a thorough investigation into Canada's changing views on immigration. For the first time since 1988, a majority of Canadians think Canada is accepting too many immigrants. This shift in attitudes is related to societal factors, especially rising housing costs. In her reporting, Wand debunks many of these misconceptions and outlines how immigrants are not the primary factor in the housing crisis, and that often they are the victims of exploitation and fraud when they come to Canada. The article lays bare the inequities in Canada's immigration system. Read Wand's full reporting on rabble.ca today. In labour news, Canadian telecom giant TELUS is being accused of undermining the union that represents its workers in Turkey. There are 1,500 TELUS workers in Turkey who monitor TikTok content for the company. Last year, 60% of those workers voted to join a union. TELUS has taken steps to bust that union by dismissing key union leaders without cause. In response to these accusations, TELUS claims to be a leader in positive labor relations with its workforce and that the union in Turkey does not meet the legal threshold to represent its workers there. Even Canadian unions, like the United Steelworkers, are calling on the federal government to investigate TELUS's behavior. United Steelworkers claims that not only is TELUS's behavior anti-union, but that they are actively trying to move parts of their operations to countries like Turkey to exploit lax labor laws. Staying in labor news, a lawsuit against the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan is highlighting the danger of pension funds investing in cryptocurrency. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, which represents 340,000 retired Ontario teachers, lost $130 million when the cryptocurrency exchange FTX went bankrupt. Now the fund is being sued, with the plaintiff demanding that the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan board members be held liable for the lost money. Whether this episode will have a chilling effect on other investment funds buying into cryptocurrency remains to be seen. A study done by the financial consulting firm KPMG found that pension funds and other investment organizations are increasingly investing their money into cryptocurrency. In national news this week, U.S. President Donald Trump has once again placed a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods being imported into the United States. On top of this move, that will be damaging to both countries' economies, Trump is also continuing to express his intention to make Canada the so-called 51st state. In an article on Rabble publisher Sarah Sahajian said that we need to go further and commit to making Canada a better society for all. Whether it be our environmental record, our relationship with Indigenous peoples, or strengthening our social services, there are many ways to make Canada a more equitable place for everyone. And finally, in environmental news, Mark Leith explains in an op-ed on rabble.ca how Liberal leadership candidate Mark Carney is no environmentalist. Carney has long publicly stated that he believes in investing in the environment, but since he's become a candidate for the federal Liberal leadership, he's begun to sing a different tune. Lately, Carney has frequently stated his belief that Canada must meet its NATO commitment of spending 2% of its GDP on its military. Not only would this drastically increase government spending, Leith points out that it is also not compatible with being an environmentalist. Global militaries are some of the world's leading polluters, not to mention the destruction that warfare inflicts on the environment. Carney can either believe in environmental change, or he can believe in increased military spending. He cannot truly believe in both, Leith argues. As always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nirenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.